2 days after October 7th, I came across a tiny handwritten message by one of the terrorists who had crossed to Israel. And was exactly the same content I had studied during Anfal, the Arabs and the Muslims and the soldiers were using. It was identical. And what was a repetition?
My guest today is Khaled Salih. Khaled is a Kurdish political scientist, former government spokesman in the Kurdistan Regional Government, former Vice Chancellor of the University of Kurdistan Hewlêr, and author of the forthcoming book, When Parochial Error Goes Global. Born into a Kurdish family, Khaled has spent decades studying the Middle East, Islam, Europe, anti-Semitism, and the forces shaping our world today. Khaled, welcome.
Thank you, Daniel.
You grew up in a secular Kurdish family. Your grandmother's family was Jewish, and much of her family moved to Israel. Then you watched Saddam Hussein invoke Quranic language while carrying out genocide against the Kurds. Looking back, was that the moment your intellectual journey began? Maybe you can take us back a little bit.
It was a surprise because in the 70s, second part of 60s and beginning of 70s, there was a wave of nationalism, Arab socialism, mixed together, socialist Arab nationalism. And then in the 80s, when Saddam Hussein was under pressure during the war and had a plan to eradicate as many of the Kurds as possible, he took a decision to label his genocidal attack by using a Quran surah. And that Quran surah has a special meaning in terms of wartime. It labels the individuals as justified to be killed. They would be called like infidel even if they were Muslims. And that was the first time I heard about an operation using a Quranic name for a Muslim population. That was a big, big surprise by a regime that was labeled and labeling itself and himself as well, Saddam Hussein, as a secular Arab nationalist. And that allowed a certain level of brutality against the Kurds, because once you use that label for a population you are attacking, everything will be allowed to do with them. Not only killing them, you can also loot whatever they have left. You don't tell anyone what you are doing if you are involved in the operations. And it was quite difficult to understand at that time how Saddam Hussein could mobilize that force by taking big groups of people to the south, close to the Jordanian border sometimes, to Kuwaiti border and Saudi border. And there were a lot of traffics going on, and they knew what was going on, but no one talked about it because the label Anfal literally made the whole operation absolutely confidential. It was very puzzling for me. So after 91, when the Kurds started to protest against Saddam Hussein and when Saddam was driven out of Kuwait, the Kurds came over tons of documents, videos, documentations, studies, interrogations, killing sessions. So that led to a couple of studies. And when then I studied that material, I realized how an idea that has nothing to do with the current situation can be utilized, rebranded, and stigmatize the whole population and become a driving force against that particular population, targeting them. Labeling was the stage number one. And that was a puzzle for me for many, many years. And I was back in 92 for the first time because I left in 82, I left Kurdistan, ended up in Sweden as a refugee and then studied. When I went back in 92, that was shortly after people came down from the mountains, after this very massive movement from Kurdistan in Iraq to Iranian and Turkish border. We could see a lot of people coming over those videos, and there was a binging. They were traumatized by what they could see was happening to those poor individuals, villagers who had nothing to do as a threat to that regime. But it became such a mobilizing force because the idea of calling them subject to Anfal justified so much more than what we could imagine if you have a normal attack against a civilian population. So it became a mobilizing force that has been with me all the time. How is that possible? And then we had a sort of resurgence of that idea in 2013 and 14 when ISIS came, and using identical methods, language, especially when they singled out the Yazidis and some Christians and some other minority groups in Kurdistan and other part of Iraq and Syria. So I could see that there is something special with this terminology, with this labeling, and with this designating a population for alienation. And then the first 2 days after October 7th, I came across a tiny handwritten message by one of the terrorists who had crossed to Israel. And was exactly the same content I had studied during Anfal, the Arabs and the Muslims and the soldiers were using. It was identical, and what was a repetition of that operating system. Then I've been working with that idea since since the Anfal operations, and then it grew up into a much bigger project. So eventually I looked at it as a system of ideas that can operate on so many levels. So in the book you mentioned, I dive into the historical context, what happens when that local error becomes a system and then travels to part of Africa. How do they deal with the populations in part of Africa? What happens with the slavery, with the concubines, with the attacks, with the absorptions of the females and the castration of the men in that operation. And then I looked at the case in Anatolia, how that particular idea of labeling a civilization you want to attack, what happens in Anatolia and how gradually that became also a very violent process. The most puzzling and quite difficult to understand was also the operation in what I call Indus Valley, because that was not a neighboring region. It was quite far. When Islam or Muslims arrived, they used the same methodology, the same ideas of labeling and then attacking. And when you look at the process, then you wonder, what is the driving force behind this behavior, if you like, this ideology, this system, and how is it possible for that idea to continue for so many centuries? Normally, people go to religion, people go to ethnicity, maybe people go to historical figures. They say Salah ad-Din did that, and Umar did that, or someone else did that. But then I focus on the basic ideas of how that particular idea crystallizes and forces people to move, to behave in a very special way. In order to understand, maybe from time to time, I have to take a traffic light as one of the comparative points. Most of us, even big cars, stop when the traffic light switches and we get red. We can't touch the idea behind the traffic light, but we all submit, respect, and behave in the particular predictive way. And that predictability helped me to understand when some ideas are formulated and becomes what I in the book called memiplex, a set of ideas. They go together, they combine in a very special way and become so anti-rational. It doesn't allow modification, it doesn't allow correction, it doesn't allow to be questioned, and it takes like a life of its own. Sometimes to understand that I have to take the rational memiplex as a contrast, where you have civilizations based on debates and questioning even the basic premises. They are not afraid. That civilization is not afraid of its basic ideas to be questioned and questioned again and then reformulated and then come up with a new kind of explanation. But when you have the anti-rational memiplex, it takes on its own journey and life and drives human beings to behave in ways. Sometimes we try with psychological explanations. It might be helpful, but it doesn't really explain, for example, when we come later to terrorism, how highly educated people can behave the way they do.
We know that the Islamic Republic of Iran, they slaughtered tens of thousands of their own people. And apparently they also invoked the Quran that these, the civilians were going against Allah, and that's what allowed them to genocide their own people. Do you see the pattern over there as well?
Yes, it's the basic idea is the labeling. And when the labeling has become so abstract, if you ask, what have I done against Allah? They can't tell you, but they say, I decide that you question Allah. You might have not questioned anything. We had very interestingly, a similar development in Turkey. When Kemal Atatürk became president, he was secular, but it became so entrenched, no one could question Kemalism, Kemal Atatürk, or Turkish nationalism in the exactly same way. Any Kurd who questioned Kemal Atatürk or asked for rights was labeled as anti that particular idea. And sometimes they call it crime against the state, crime against whatever they can come up with. But the most powerful ones I have studied is when you say you have done something against Allah. There is no way you can convince someone you haven't done it when you get that label, because you don't
Yeah.
know what the accusation is about. And they don't know either. But the labeling is so effective, it can go very, very far. For example, when we studied some of the attacks from ISIS against the Yazidis, they by default called Yazidis, they are a people against Allah's will. These people have been there before the idea of Allah joined the Middle East. But then when that label is used, killing becomes sanctioned. And that's what happened in Iran. That's what happened during Anfal. That's what happened during October 7th. That's what happened when they attacked the Yazidis. And we had also a similar case in the transition between the Ottoman Empire to the Turkish Republic, when the old Ottoman elite singled out the Armenians as the enemy of Islam. So they committed genocide, first genocide against them already, and mobilized even people who had nothing to do with the interests of killing those Armenians. But it became so powerfully mobilized, so it blinded the people who acted on those ideas. It's a fascinating way of trying to understand what happens when that memeplex take over. And in modern time, I mean, I'm tempted sometimes to look at what's lately been called wokeism. Fully rational individuals, educated in very well-off societies, go into directions you just don't recognize. You just wonder, what happened here? And then when you look at the basic premises of how they formulate, how they think, what they use an abstraction, you recognize suddenly, oh, there is a memeplex, anti-rational memeplex in operation here as well. It's called maybe DI, maybe it's called Black Lives Matter, maybe it's something else, but it's abstract. And it forces people to act in a very particular way.
Now, you distinguish between Muslims and the ideas you're criticizing, between Islam and Islamism. Why is that distinction so important?
It's important because I have met so many people who never submitted to those ideas. And then you suddenly meet someone who's, for example, in my case, in personal story, I had friends who were former communists in the 70s and 80s, but suddenly captured by this idea of Islamic political system. When they lost faith in communism, it was easy for them to pick up the faith on the Islamic side. So there must be something with the idea that attracts in a very special way. And those ideas can travel. Some individuals take those ideas with them. Some of them are leaving the ideas. So if it was ethnic or deterministic, then we wouldn't have ups and downs in those trends. Sometimes I try to understand it through looking at Germany, a rational, enlightened society, technologically advanced until something goes wrong. And suddenly the elite is captured by a very anti-rational memeplex idea. And they go so far, so they use all the modernity tools to exterminate as many people as Jewish as possible. So that's why I say we need to distinguish between the individuals and the ideas that are in operation. And when the ideas capture the brain, the mind, the way of thinking, it forces some individuals to move, to behave in a very particular way. But it's not deterministic, because we have had people who leave the memeplex or start questioning it. But the organization behind it, if it becomes too compact in a closed society, in a static society, then discussions will not be permitted. So most people who are not submitting to the ideas, they just try to survive by not questioning, by not discussing, by not approaching, just live their ordinary life and try to get away as much as possible from raising those issues. That's why if you look at the numbers, if you have 1.5 billion Muslims and everyone is affected by that idea, then we should have seen a different world. But we don't. We see a world in which some individuals, some groups, some of them for political reasons, some of them are captured by the ideas, some might have issues that we cannot see beforehand, suddenly join this kind of movements that are capturing their attention and then forcing them to behave the way it does. What also makes it interesting, if you look at some of the converted people who convert to Islam, Europeans, Americans, when you listen to their debate, you recognize that this doesn't make sense, given the ethnic background, given the upbringing, given the level of welfare they have grown up in. You just can't understand how is this possible. But if you look at it as an idea that captures mind, then it's easier for me to explain. Oh, there is something in the making that forces that individual and that group to behave in that particular way. So I distinguish between the individual and the idea. And also, it's optimistic and hopeful. If we cannot distinguish between the idea and the individual, we have to give up. And in life, we can't give up. We have to have the hope all the time that sometimes part of Europe went totally crazy. Before, it was Enlightenment. Suddenly you had the dark period. And then later, after they were forced error correction on Germany by attacking them, dismantling the ideology and the memeplex and the organizations behind it, Germany became a different country. German economy, German thinking, German openness, German generosity, German receiving foreigners became a totally different society, open to revision, open to error correction. So we have this risk of being hijacked. If we give up the idea of error correction, then I'm afraid we can't get so far.
Yeah. Now, you also argued that open societies have to protect Muslims while criticizing Islamism, but why has that become so difficult, and how is that exactly supposed to be done?
I think the problem that started to become very, very obvious, maybe from 70s onwards, was that the elite, and elite on most levels, the media level, academic level, political level, they started to mix the idea and the people. So some of them, they say we have to protect Islamic ideology in order to protect someone who believes in it. Rather than saying, well, respect your belief, we protect you, but we still can question your ideas. Your ideas are not you. You are not the idea. You carry something, and that's not something you cannot change. And if you don't distinguish, then you also become the essentialist the Muslims activists want you to be. The Islamists, the Muslim activists would like to label everyone as essentialist, essentially racist. And for that reason, if you don't distinguish, they mobilize so many more people against the society that has given them protection, rights, citizenship, education, all of that is being offered. And suddenly they are turned against this very same society. And that's what happened with the woke as well, by the way. These are people from high education institutions suddenly become totally irrational in many ways, behave like an anti-rational operation system. You just wonder, how is this possible? And some of them left eventually. And I followed several cases of anti-Zionist, totally obsessed anti-Zionist, anti-Israeli activists suddenly realized, hey, maybe I am on the wrong track. Maybe I haven't questioned my own ideas. Maybe I am hijacked by a set of thinking that moves me emotionally. And then when you question that, then there's hope. And when there's hope, there is potential for growth and for revision. And if you don't have that revision issue, in the book, I use a metaphor. I call it the backspace key. I don't know if you give me time to explain that, because I find it very interesting. Before, when we just had a typewriter, whatever you put on the paper, you had to take it out and correct it manually with Tipex and with some other manual correction. And then gradually, when computer came, they inserted this button called backspace key. You have your text on the screen. It's not fixed. You still can go back to it and correct the mistake you have. And if we look at that option, that backspace key is very important for life itself, for debate itself, for open society itself. If a policy is mistaken, then it's discussed and revised. If a law is mistaken or becomes misapplied, then you have to regulate it in a different way so that it doesn't harm the individuals. The most resourceful thing we have in life is human, from our perspective, of course, from human perspective. That is the most resourceful and the most beautiful thing we have. So if we don't look after that part of life, then we might mistake the idea for the individual and then mix the two. And then we behave the way they want us to behave. Then we are stuck in their cycle of accusations and escalation.
Now, you argued that after October 7th, Islamist ideas found allies far beyond the Islamist circles. You had the universities, you have the activist movements, parts of the media, parts of the political left. How did that happen exactly?
Well, this has been a process going on for quite a long time. If you look at, we have somehow to go back to Muslim Brothers. They started in Egypt, they mobilized, they politicized, and they are excellent in organization. And when they were under pressure in Egypt, they came out of Egypt, they expanded in Europe, and they have tailored a very goal-oriented program of how to go about to recruit, to spread the idea, to demonize, and also to find common areas. In some countries, they go into green parties. In some areas, some countries, they cooperate with left-wing parties. So they find a common area, whether it is anti-Jewish, anti-Israeli, anti-colonial in the US, or Aborigine issues like in Australia. They study the society they want to influence, and they figure out what works in this system. And mind you, they are very well-educated individuals we're talking about. So the mobilizers, the organizers, the ideologues, they are coming from well-educated background. They are intelligent, but they are not rational in that sense. Because a lot of Germans were also very intelligent when they started the Holocaust, but they had lost the rationality. They did not question what they were doing. The same mechanism is in play here. These individuals are very intelligent. They know laws, they know media, they know how to recruit people with celebrities, they know how to organize galas. They are very intelligent in a limited, purposeful way, but they will never question the basic premises of what they are doing, because that demands a lot of rationality. That's why they remain in the anti-rational part of the activities. And then because they spread out maybe from the beginning of 90s, mid-90s definitively, they cooperated with a lot of groups. And the most surprising element was already on the 7th and 8th of October 2003, that things kickstarted in a way that was surprising for every observer, except for the ones who were behind the organization. In Israel, they hadn't figured out how many people were killed, how many people were kidnapped. They did not even know the first week, what are we going to do? 1 week hasn't even passed. These groups had already mobilized on such a high level, they start to accuse the victim they just attacked a week earlier. And that demands a lot of anti-rational thinking, because they did not see those individuals as humans. They were driven by this idea of my right or no other way. And that allowed a lot of groups in Western societies to adopt those ideas. And they were very cleverly tailoring it. In some countries, they do it as anti-colonialism. In some other countries, they do it anti-Zionism. In some areas, they recruit people with anti-Likud. If Likud is in the government, anti-Likud government. If it is a socialist government, it could have been an anti-socialist group that will join the group they recruit. So they are distinguishing between different approaches in a very systematic way, and they prepare the ground. They have long-term goal. Compared with democracies who are focusing on the next 4 years, they don't care about those elections. For them is a long-term goal. And that gives you institutional memory, that gives you institutional recruitment, that gives you funding from a country like Qatar. And in the 90s and before Qatar took over, even Saudi Arabia and Emirates were funding those organizations and mosques with petrodollars for generations. So the ground has been worked systematically. Organizations been in the making for such a long time. So by the time October 7th massacre and pogrom happened, they had already placards in place. On the 8th, organizations in American universities issued a statement. So it needed a lot of cooperation for that. And some of them had information about the upcoming attack even before, because we could read between the lines that there is something else going on with those early texts. So there's a lot of work behind it. And when you are, what I say in the book, intelligent but anti-rational, you can go very far, the way the Germans did and the Nazism, and now the way those groups are doing. They are very intelligent, but they are anti-rational, and they can mobilize effectively. Unfortunately.
Yes. You spoke about how after October 7th, Israel took a little bit of time to mobilize and go into Gaza, and they came up with a plan. Can you maybe elaborate on how they were able to bounce back after experiencing such a huge massacre?
It was a shock, a system shock. In the political and security environment of Israel, this conceptia was actually like its own anti-rational memeplex running the relationship with Gaza. It was preventing information going up into the chain. It was preventing people to see what was going on, although they could see what was going on. The concepts, the conceptia of Hamas is not going to ruin what they have built by attacking us, other than just like before. That prevented them from deciphering the signals that were coming out. And when the shock came, it took almost, when I looked closely, it took almost a week to drop the whole conceptia idea, to reorganize and remobilize and come up with a plan. And the plan was, it has to be systematic, and we have to give up whatever idea we were operating from. It's survival. That is our game now. And in order to implement that, we have to have a long-term plan. Some of those ideas or operations were going on 20 years, as we discovered later with the Beeper explosions. They were in the making for 20 years maybe. But then they came up with the idea that we have to do it systematically and step by step, isolating Gaza first, control whatever is possible to control, save as many as possible, and then go to the north gradually, and then expand it from north to Iran. And that needed a particular way of thinking. We have to do it step by step. We have to do it consciously. We have to put our survival as the driving force for what we are doing. Before that, the conceptia had almost removed survival from the game. And now survival became the error correction for Israel. And the error correction went so far, and I've written a couple of articles about the technological breakthroughs they showed sign of when they first time went to Iran, and in principle blinded the whole anti-missile system Iranians has installed from Russia, and what they learned step by step, and then prepared the ground for the Americans to come and attack Iran last summer. These were ideas which I would like to call an impressive error correction mechanism. We made a mistake, but that mistake is not allowed to eat us alive. We recognize the mistake was huge, catastrophic in many cases of the families, individuals, and kidnapped and killed, and children who were affected. That was a massive mistake. But how can we correct it? We have to have a new way of dealing with these issues. And that shifted the whole strategy. There are a couple of operations, if you study it carefully, you just cannot, other than just be impressed. When they went to Syria, before Assad left Syria, there was one particular operation. They went into a tunnel, an underground missile production, without the Russians, the Syrians, anyone discovering what they were doing before they left. They dismantled. They did not allow that error to be repeated again. The same happened with the assassination of Haniya and others who were targeted. They had to be removed from the mistake we have committed. And that error is not allowed to happen again. So the error correction became the driving force. And even this time, when we see what Trump is doing, I just, as you said, published this article that I say much of what's been achieved is because Israel systematically prepared the ground for 2 years, moving the ring of fire in so many places, neutralizing Hamas, and then weakening Hezbollah to a degree that it's not any longer a threat directly to Israel. And then the attacks they had against Houthis and the threats against Iraqi militias. One story, I don't know if you know about it, one of the closest aides of Nasrallah went to Baghdad shortly after Nasrallah was killed, and he was about to cross the border to Iran. They killed him exactly when he crossed the border on the Iranian side. And that demands high intelligence profiling and follow-up, because that error is not allowed to be missed again. And the error correction is now the driving force for what I see, and helping now even Trump to implement his doctrine against Iran.
You served as an examiner for a PhD thesis on the Muslim Brotherhood because no one else wanted to touch it. Why were academics reluctant, and why do many European institutions struggle to discuss issues like the Muslim Brotherhood openly and honestly?
There are several explanations for this, but my favorite one is they are also kidnapped by an academic memeplex, anti-rational academic memeplex, whereby you don't question your premises. Those activists are good by nature. Their ideas not as threatening as we might think. That's why we don't need to question them. So most of the academics who were asked, some of them didn't want to touch it because they were afraid personally, because we have had people like academics attacked for what they have written. Especially if you are from the region, you will have a lot of issues. If you are Muslim by background, you will have issues. And the day the examination was carried out, it was the first time in a Swedish university for any particular subject discussed publicly, because these are public events in Scandinavian countries. So a lot of people are coming, and it's an open debate. You have to make your text available, and it's ritualized. It was the first time we had very high level of security arranged for everyone at the university at that particular location. Nothing like that had happened before. And some people who were approached, they were also coming from special disciplines. For example, if you have Islamologists, for them, you don't study Islam as an ideology. You just study it as a religion. So they would say, no, thank you. It's not our area. And they would say, well, there was also a very strong left-wing academic movement in Sweden. They labeled Muslim Brotherhoods as almost a socialist movement. They were looking at them as third world socials alternative. Sometimes they will invite them to all those academic conferences to talk about alternatives to capitalism, alternatives to decadence, alternatives to develop societies the Muslim way that can have some commonality with the communist or socialist way. So those academics didn't want anyone to question those activities. So for me, it was quite interesting, because I just came from Kurdistan and I had been in Baghdad. I had been escorted into security areas, and suddenly experience that in Sweden was quite strange. Escorted by police into an exam.
Now, you argued that Iran's strategy was outsource violence, surround Israel, frighten the West, and make correction too costly. Do you believe that strategy has now been fundamentally weakened?
It's been undermined from its basis for the first time. But it has taken such a long time. These Israelis, or the Israeli security forces and political decisions, removed the fire, the proxies, their abilities, their finances, their weaponry before the big attack last year. So this has been in the making for 2 years, maybe now almost 3 years soon. And the Israelis wanted to undermine those particular proxies, strategies, and the fear. Because before killing Nasrallah, everyone said in the Muslim world, if the Israelis dare to attack Nasrallah, the whole Shia world will rise. And when Nasrallah was eliminated, then people who don't know the strategy said, that's okay, he's not head of state. Israel will never attack a head of state. Then at the end of February this year, they went for the highest in the Iranian leadership. So they removed the fear by going systematically after those individuals who were behind the octopus, the ring of fire, the financing, the training. But we normally forget also what Trump did already when in his first term. And there is a lot of speculation that was done in coordination with the Israeli intelligence. But he removed the most influential operator of that Iranian net, Qasem Soleimani, in Baghdad. By killing him, for the first time, they removed the first layer of fear, that the most effective operator of that network is not immune. And when you remove that immunization, the psychological effect was quite obvious for a few years in Iran. But then October 7th pogrom changed the game, and people were afraid again that the level of brutality that was on display scared a lot of people, that if such a small group can do this, what about Hezbollah? What about Iran? What if all of them go together? What will happen? So the level of fear was so high for almost half a year until they killed the first Hamas man in Beirut, Salah Harouri, in an apartment. That was also the first removal of fear strategy. And then they went after one by one. And they tested also with the Iranians when they attacked an Iranian general in Damascus. That was also a removing fear strategy. Everyone was panicking. Oh, Iran will overreact, and the whole Muslim world will do this and that. But because it was done so strategically and so systematically, it prepared the ground for the first attack last year and for this round of American involvement. But this time is different because the Americans went also into the economic sanctioning model, whereby Iranian economy is also under massive pressure.
Do you believe that the Iranian regime learned anything from the last 2.5 years, or do you think that they're still operating under the same assumptions?
Here is the problem. The regime is gone. The most important decision makers are not there anymore. The ones we have now, they are new decision makers. They are interested in what can they safe in their own society and their skin. They have seen what happened with the most untouchable ones. So they can use some maneuver, some attacks, some threats, but it doesn't go to work any longer because the level of fear is so removed so dramatically, it doesn't work at all. And the ones who are there, maybe not on the operational level, but the decision-making level, they're all new in a sense. And we might quite soon figure out that Ali Khamenei's son hasn't been with us since February. It's just been used as a...
Now, you make the distinction between regime change and regime alteration. What's the difference between them?
The regime change is a concept that comes almost from the Second World War, almost, by replacing the Nazis. And then it became a model and gained attraction back when they removed Saddam Hussein and became a very powerful concept. I worked with Pentagon at that time. I was involved in that discussion internally. The idea was to change the regime entirely and replace it with a new government structure. In the case of Germany, they dismantled every Nazi institution. They had a similar idea with Iraq. They removed all the Ba'athist institutions. That created so many issues because back in the 40s, the discussion was different. The war was different. And the news cycles and the impatience of democracies were different in the 2000s. And now we don't have patience for more than next news cycle. So we want everything to be achieved by the time we go to bed. And that's not how political, military, economic reality is operating. It takes time, energy, coordination, planning, long-term. Sometimes you have to put massive investments in tiny changes in those societies because they don't have the capacity and institutions that can carry those ideas. So it became it was a backfire in Iraq. In many ways, we still hold elections in Iraq, but it did not really work out the way regime change idea, philosophy, or doctrine was about to convince us. Trump administration revisited that idea, said, we don't want to be involved in regime change by our military do not have capacity to build societies. They are built to fight. In the Iraq case, for example, the military were given tasks to build schools. They were looking after sewages. That's not a military capacity. They say, no, we go, we change the upper echelon, like we did in Venezuela. We keep the rest, but we dictate the process. For example, in the case of Iraq, all the Shia groups came to power because Americans removed Saddam Hussein. 3 weeks later, they all became anti-American, automatically. And then the same administration who was talking about regime change had to deal with those people who were killing Americans on the streets of Baghdad. But they couldn't do so much about it because they had a mission of building a new set of society, institutions, and culture. They did not achieve so much of that. The Trump administration, and it's actually there is a lot of forces behind that. Trump is maybe the public face of that idea. We shouldn't do that again. What we do is, once we remove, we dictate. We dictate the conditions, the process, and we make sure anyone who is not on board with those ideas will be removed quickly. So now, just today or yesterday, Trump's new envoy to Iraq came and decided no more militias in Iraq. They have to give up their weapon. We are not going to pay and guarantee your security if you don't do as we demanded. And the Prime Minister said, of course. We'll see if that will be implemented easily. But then the game is different now. Iran is not as powerful. Iran's tentacles are removed. Iran's fire is extinguished in many places. So there is a hope, even for Iraq and Kurdistan.
You have argued that anti-Zionism often becomes a carrier for old anti-Semitic ideas. Why does anti-Semitism keep returning generation after generation, often in different forms?
Anti-Semitism has this pattern, as David Deutsch explains it so elegantly. This pattern is like, it has its own life. Is humanity's oldest pattern, recurring, harming the Jews in that pattern is the carrying element. And when it is expressed as anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, it usually has a parochial element that is driven into the surface. For example, back in the 60s and 70s, most left-wing groups in Europe were not anti-Zionist. In fact, they were admiring the socialism of Israel introduced in many ways. And then gradually that shifted. Initially, the conservatives were a little bit of anti-Zionist, and then the right wings were properly anti-Zionist. Although in the case of Germany and Italy, we call them right-wing, but they were actually left-wing ideologues pretending to be right-wing. But they were very much left-wing in terms of what they wanted to achieve. And this resurfaces what is quite fascinating to see how this anti-rational memeplex captures people's, groups, institutions is the simplification. For example, the Soviets figured out very quickly back in the 70s, we label Israel as racist. That's it. It's still running. It became part of the UN setup. Everything that has to do with Israel in the UN context is racism. And that was so captivating for so many countries, peoples, individuals, and organizations. It just takes on its own life because it's so simple. Then with the new immigration, you have people from Muslim backgrounds. They have this Zionism, anti-Semitism combination from education, from religion, from jealousy. For example, most Arab and Muslim countries cannot figure out how such a small society come to a desert land, turn it into greenery, and install a state and an economy that's almost miraculous compared with all the resources they have, but they cannot achieve 10% of what the Jews and Israelis have done in terms of progress, development, health, education, technology, military technology, whatever you discuss. It's a source of envy. And envy is very easy to mobilize. So you give it the right label, it goes home with you. I have friends who were very, very mild when they were left-wing. Now when they have left, they are so anti-Zionist, Jewish, Israeli, they don't understand, they cannot explain it, but it's so emotionally strong for them. And they are both Europeans, Kurdish, Turkish, Iranians. When it is so simplified, it captivates and it becomes like it carries its own life many, many times.
Yeah. Khaled, I want to thank you for your time. Appreciate all your insights. How can people find you, your books, your writings? Please let us know.
Thank you for this opportunity. I am active on Substack under my name. I have 2 books coming up. One of them is already released. It's called Kurdistan Azad. It's about the Kurdish history, story, suffering, and error correction, I call as well. And then the other one on Islam is coming also quite soon on Substack and also on Amazon, both of them, maybe in 2-3 weeks. So if you want to have a look at my Substack, you're most than welcome.
Thank you. Thank you again. And wishing you all the best.
Thank you, sir.